Seeing the Soviet blockade, the Cato alliance would probably try to find another route to supply the Venezuelans, eventually finding one through Brazil. So now, the Soviets were in quite a predicament. No matter what they did, Western aid would still be delivered to the Venezuelans. Malenkov would probably grow frustrated with the Venezuelans and would probably try to coup the government through direct means, since the blockade wouldn't be efficient enough. Thus, Russian forces would be on the way to stop the Venezuelan uprising. They would most likely be dropped off in neighboring Colombia, from where they would begin marching towards the Venezuelan border. Much of the Colombian population would be against this action, but the government would support Malenkov's forces in the hopes that the Russians would return the favor and offer more financial and food aid. Seeing their government aligning with the Soviets over the Venezuelans, many Colombians would begin forming paramilitary organizations and conducting guerrilla warfare on the Soviet convoys that were on the way to the Venezuelan border. Venezuela, now facing an overwhelming force, requests the aid of Cato and other Cato-aligned nations. Brazil, Argentina, France, Britain, the Eurasians, and many more provide the essential military and financial aid to the Venezuelans in exchange for guarantees to access the Venezuelan petrol fields after the conflict is over. Many Venezuelan military leaders defect to the Soviet Union to provide them with essential military information on the Venezuelan army, which eventually leads to the Venezuelan leadership enacting purges in their command to get rid of the Soviet sympathizers. The president of Venezuela declares that the Soviets have betrayed the communist values that they all fought for, and by increasing military spending, interfering in other countries around the globe by giving them weapons, and spreading their influence everywhere, they have become just like the imperialist powers they swore to destroy. Furthermore, the president of Venezuela suggests that Malenkov and Stalin are nothing more than charlatans that used the ideals of communism as a way for them to acquire power and become the most powerful men in the world. All cards were on the table now, and the war fully began. On a hot summer morning in 1957, the first shot rang out in the jungles of Venezuela. Soviet forces marched towards Caracas with the intent of ending the rebellion. The Soviets, high off of their successes so far in the Cold War, believed that they had the upper hand. And they did. The poorly trained Venezuelan troops were easily pushed back. Even though the Venezuelan troops had the advantage of defending in very forested areas, mountains, and using guerrilla tactics, the Soviets still managed to push through. But of course, in the wet jungle terrain, their progress would be excruciatingly slow. With the Venezuelans actively losing, this would make them even more desperate, calling for even more military aid and maybe even foreign troops. The Eurasians would know this would be a bad move, as it would bring them directly into conflict with the Soviets. Thus, the Eurasians would find another solution. Hey, what? Go help them. No way in hell. What? No way in hell. The Soviets will... Oh. With Brazilian forces joining the fray, the situation would stabilize, for now at least. The Soviets would condemn the involvement of Cato-aligned countries into the conflict and say that the current president of Venezuela was a Cato-installed puppet. While many in North America would believe this, many countries like Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, and especially Colombia would see this statement as at most weird and at worst propaganda. This would only exacerbate public sentiment in South America, but the Soviets still had one advantage. The way the Soviet government responded to the Venezuelan uprising kept most governments in this region in check. At this moment in time, the Soviets would have at most 80,000 soldiers in the field against the Venezuelan 60,000 soldiers supported by Brazilian forces of around 30,000 soldiers. While the Venezuelans might have the numerical advantage, the Soviets still possessed a clear advantage in both quality equipment and mechanized capabilities. The only saving grace of the Venezuelans would be the arms shipments from Cato. As the second year of the war began, the condition in Venezuela kept worsening. Venezuela and Brazil were not able to hold the front line steady as the Soviets started pouring in troops into the war, with their numbers reaching almost 200,000. Not only that, but the president started becoming increasingly authoritarian with mass arrests, forced conscription laws, and active censorship. The situation got so bad that other countries such as Argentina and Uruguay had to intervene and send volunteers as well. The war was looking extremely grim for the Venezuelans. Their coalition numbered about 350,000 soldiers who were mostly Venezuelan conscripts. The Brazilian population was starting to get fed up with this conflict and many protests started across the country, similar to what the US experienced when they sent troops to Vietnam. In the third year of the war, the Soviets once again made significant gains. Many of the Venezuelan oil fields were near the front lines and even the capital. Caracas was a few kilometers away. But 3 years of constant conflict was a massive burden for the Soviet economy, both on the public support front and the fact that they barely had enough funds to support Malenkov's Navy plan. Oh yeah, and you can bet that their South American allies received almost nothing, despite hoping that aligning themselves against Venezuela would provide them with help. Thus, in Bolivia, there would be a violent coup done by the military, hoping to align with Western powers. Peru's leader, although Soviet aligned at the beginning, seeing the writing on the wall, would declare that Peru will leave Comecon and seek neutrality. In Ecuador and Colombia, mass protests would start against the Soviets, with people demanding that their governments would stop supporting the Soviet invasion of Venezuela. The Soviets, seeing the writing on the wall and fearing a domino effect, evacuated their troops and reinforced their military presence in Central America. After the Soviet evacuation, two surprising things happened. Firstly, the communist government of Colombia fell and got replaced by a Cato-aligned one, while the president of Venezuela declared the formation of the Social Republic of Venezuela, combining features from both the communist system of Venezuela and various systems from the capitalist world. The most surprising outcome out of all of this was that Ecuador did not fall to the domino effect. The government there managed to keep control, although mainly because they managed to finish collectivization and the people were doing relatively well now. With the chaos in Africa coming to an end by now, many new nation states would have formed. Most of Western Africa would have by now fallen to communist ideologies, while the rest of the continent on the other hand would be a completely different story. East Africa would start out divided at the beginning, but soon a charismatic Napoleon-like leader would fill in the void, and conquer various parts willing to form an East African empire. This state would be surprisingly efficient and control vast resources, which would make them an incredibly important ally to the Cato Alliance. In the south of the continent, South Africa had survived the fall and even expanded a little, even creating buffer states between them and the communists. The situation in Africa, although tensioned, would be fairly stabilized as there wouldn't be many points of conflict, as the two blocks would be separated by each other either by the Sahara or by vast jungles, with the Eurasian Republic finally settling into their new role and securing their borders. They finally end martial law after over 2 decades, and for the first time in what feels like forever, democratic elections once again take place in the new land of the free. In 1960, the two major parties both put out what they felt would be the right choice. For the Republicans, General Dwight D. Eisenhower would swear to be tough on communists and keep them at bay. On the other side, the Democrats put forward a young JFK, willing to focus more on the economy and creating a stronger tie with the rest of the European continent. To nobody's surprise, Kennedy manages to win with a landslide 71% of the vote, with many Americans willing to focus more on domestic affairs rather than external, and also because of fear. The fear that a general like Eisenhower would once again drag Eurasia back into martial law and authoritarianism. Kennedy would focus more on jump-starting the economy, reinforcing alliance with China and Cato members, and would be the first to propose the Manifest Destiny Transit Pact, a law that would allow not only Eurasians, but also Europeans to travel wherever they please without the need of border guards, security checks, or any other stuff. Similar to the Schengen area in the European Union in our world. This results in economic booms across Cato countries, as many businesses can set up shop in other countries with ease. Great infrastructure projects such as highways or railways start connecting the entire continent. And with the Cato allies in Africa, South America and Southeast Asia sending raw materials to the continent, this leads to an incredible economic growth in Europe, thus becoming the manufacturing capital of the world. During this time, India would have reached a tipping point, and as unrest escalated, Britain would ultimately decide to give them independence. As the Kato alliance would be prospering during these times, the Indian subcontinent would most likely align themselves with Kato, signing trade deals and starting friendly relations with them. China would face turmoil. The authoritarian regime led by Chiang Kai-shek would still be in power and the economy wouldn't be doing very well. Many remember the tragedy that happened in Yan'an and criticize the government. Of course, this ultimately leads to China censoring any negative opinion against the government to keep public order in check. The president of Eurasia, Kennedy, would be opposed to seeing such a rise of authoritarianism in China and would openly criticize the Chinese government. Many Kato countries would start imposing sanctions on China in hopes of preventing another ultranationalist regime taking over a country and hoping that this would move China towards liberalization. This move would have the reverse effect, as since most of China's economy was dependent on the Kato bloc, this leads to an economic collapse in China, with reverberations in Kato countries as well. Chiang Kai-shek manages to hold control of his country by blaming all the unfortunes on the Western powers. Sir, our economy is collapsing. It's the fault of those Eurasians. Sir, we are losing our influence on the world market. Those damn Eurasians. Sir, your wife has cheated on you. God damn Eurasia! China would once again claim Outer Manchuria as they were once a part of China. This entire set of events would later be seen as a diplomatic disaster for the Kato powers, as they allowed China to slip up off the road to becoming a democracy and instead created a rival authoritarian regime in Asia. Japan would finally awaken from its slumber and decide to align with the Chinese. Emperor Hirohito and Chiang Kai-shek would finally meet, but this time as allies instead of enemies. Both would create a new alliance, the Asian United Front, or AUF for short. Other countries would join, such as most of Southeast Asia and Korea, who would now be part of this alliance. Pakistan, a former Kato aligned nation, would switch its stance and draw closer to this new AUF bloc. This alliance would also have positive relations with the East African Empire, creating a third way besides communism and democracies, that being authoritarian empires. China and Japan would begin amassing troops on the Sino-Eurasian border in Manchuria. For the first time since the end of World War II, the world has stopped being a bipolar world, that being a world where two states have the most power, and now has become a multipolar world. Although China and Japan would not attack right now, due to the fear of nuclear retaliation, both of these governments would begin researching nuclear weapons in secret to gain an even footing against the Eurasians. The Chinese would already have experts that have worked across the Kato alliance, who would have the expertise to construct a bomb, and since the Chinese already had developed an industrial base and military research centers before the sanctions, they would leverage this in an effort to gain nuclear capabilities. But eventually, the world would find out that Japan and China were trying to acquire nuclear weapons. The entire Kato alliance would condemn the Asians for this and cite a breach on the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. The Soviets would condemn this act as well, Malenkov himself saying this act would lead the world closer to total annihilation. The entire Eurasian military high command would be in a panic, with multiple satellite images showing suspicious activity in the Mongolian desert. The Eurasians aren't willing to wait around for the Chinese to acquire the bomb right in their backyard. They immediately mobilize the armed forces and air force, leading to Japan, seeing where this is going, immediately mobilizes. Their army begins fortifying the Chinese border, and the navy starts securing the sea lanes that connect the alliance. The Southeast Asian members shut off the international shipping lanes that pass through that region and blockade Singapore, a Kato-aligned city-state. In 1964, on the celebration of the Chinese New Year, also known as the beginning of the Year of the Dragon, the first Eurasian troops marched south into China. The initial invasion sees moderate success, pushing past the Chinese border in the north. The offensive stalls as Japanese divisions reinforce Chinese defenses. Still, the war is escalating fast. Back in Japan though, things aren't going so well. Years of authoritarian rule, food shortages and a failing economy spark mass protests across the country. Eventually, everything boils over. In a shocking turn of events, a full-blown communist revolution erupts in eastern Japan, centered around Osaka and Sendai. The imperial government suddenly finds itself fighting a war on two fronts, one against the Eurasians in China and one inside their own borders. Now, focusing all of its energy on survival, Japan pulls most of its troops from the Chinese fronts. And guess who shows up? The Soviets. Seeing an opportunity, Malenkov wastes no time. The SSA begins shipping weapons, food, and volunteer forces to the communist rebels in Japan. Before long, the Soviets openly declare their support for the revolution, and soon enough, they too are officially in the war. This time on the side of the Japanese communists. At the same time, the Eurasians manage to finally achieve a breakthrough, and the Chinese defenses finally fall. The Eurasians beeline for Beijing, but then in the Chinese desert, the silence is finally over. China has officially joined the nuclear club. The moment this happens, panic sets in. The Eurasians, terrified of a retaliatory strike, immediately call for a ceasefire. They can't risk a nuclear exchange, not after everything they've just been through. China, now with the upper hand, agrees. China announces it will redirect its efforts to aid its AUF allies in Japan. The Soviets are not pleased. Malenkov responds with a chilling warning. If China dares to use nuclear weapons against the communist rebels, the SSA will retaliate with nuclear force of their own. And just like that, the world pulls back from the brink of destruction once again. No peace treaty, no resolution, just a frozen conflict. The Eurasians return most of the conquered Chinese lands and sign a non-aggression pact. Japan becomes this world's version of North and South Korea, and as the years pass, nothing much changes. The balance of powers is pretty even without favoring anyone. Conflicts may of course begin, but in places with border friction and claims, such as Africa and India and Pakistan, although for the most part, the world is peaceful. In this world, I could see the Soviets slowly liberalizing after the death of Malenkov, seeing how a rise in authoritarianism alienated other allies. This would eventually lead to the SSA to a form of democratic communism, where people get to choose the representatives. In the Keto Alliance, we could see more integration both militarily and politically. As such, we might get to see a common currency, a common justice system, and a Keto military. The AUF bloc would slowly become the manufacturing center of the world, with experts from Japan, cheap labor from China, and southeastern allies controlling the sea lanes. This world wouldn't be perfect, but it would be certainly moving in the right direction. That was pretty much it. Hope you enjoyed the scenario, and see you all in the next video.